I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Welcome to our presentation on local journalism and transparency in Massachusetts. This program is part of Sunshine Week, an annual national campaign to raise awareness about the challenges to our right to know about government. We at NEFAC, the New England First Amendment Coalition, are working every day to protect that right in all 6 New England states. We're fighting secrecy and protecting your First Amendment freedoms through defense, advocacy, and education. I would encourage all of you to learn more about our coalition at nefac.org and support our efforts by becoming a sustaining member at nefac.org/join. Before I get to introductions, I would like to give a special thanks to the Medfield Insider for co-sponsoring this program. Please learn more about the Medfield Insider and subscribe to it at medfieldinsider.com. We have a great discussion in store for you today, featuring Charlie Sennett of the Ground Truth Project and Report for America. He'll be moderating the conversation and taking all of your questions. Charlie is joined by NEFAC board member and media law attorney Peter Caruso. Peter will be concluding the program with a Public Records 101. He's going to be looking at the law in Massachusetts and answering any questions you may have about how to best obtain the documents, the information about government that you need. Also joining us is Boston Globe reporter Kay Lazar and Morgan C. Mullings, a reporter at the Bay State Banner and a member of Report for America. I want to thank you all for being here. Before we begin, please note that the Q&A function is available to ask questions throughout the program. The chat box is also available to use as well for other comments, though please keep them respectful and on point. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible throughout the program. With that said, I now present you Charlie Sennett.
Great, thank you, Justin. I appreciate it, and thanks so much to New England First Amendment Coalition for sponsoring this, and Medfield Insider, Chris, thanks. This is an incredible opportunity at a really critical moment to talk about the need for better access to public records in our Commonwealth of Massachusetts and around the country. I want to just thank all of you who are tuning in for being here. This is called Sunshine Week. And this is a beautiful Friday afternoon, at least where I'm looking out in central Massachusetts. The sun is shining brightly, and 40 of you have decided to have one more Zoom call in your life and join us today, and that is commendable. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I can't wait to hear your questions. Really looking forward to seeing where you want to take the conversation. We're going to try to get there pretty quickly. Justin asked me to sort of start by sharing with you a little bit of the work we do at the Ground Truth Project. So my history in journalism is right here in front of us in some ways. My alma mater is where Kay works now, the Boston Globe. I worked there for 15 years. And I now am the co-founder of Report for America, where Morgan is. We're really proud to have Morgan as one of the reporters who we support through Report for America, for her work serving the community in Massachusetts and the readership of the Bay State Banner. So let me just start by saying I left the Globe in 2006 and began a lot of work as an entrepreneur trying to think about this moment in journalism. It's an incredibly challenging moment. It's a real crisis. And I founded a nonprofit organization that's called the Ground Truth Project, and we support an emerging generation of journalists to do important social justice reporting in undercovered corners of the world, but mostly right here in America. And our flagship program that we launched about 4 years ago is called Report for America. So for those of you who know Teach for America, think Teach for America, but for journalism. It's a call to service for young reporters to go out and serve in communities, to do like what Morgan's doing. So Morgan is working in City Hall and the State House for the Bay State Banner, and she's really looking at the issues that impact African-American residents of the Commonwealth, that really take on the issues that need to be examined more deeply. And we're really proud to be able to give newsrooms like the Bay State Banner some support to bring in talent like Morgan. We do this around the country. We now support 300 reporters in 200 newsrooms, and we are in just about every state in the country right now. The reporting is around the country, and what binds all of these reporters together is that they're serving in local newsrooms and local communities where there's an undercovered corner of their community. That's true for our reporters in Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta. They're covering criminal justice and the outrages in the prison system. In Appalachia, we have reporters on the ground who are reporting on post-coal economies and the way they've been ravaged. We're in rural Ohio where, you know, industrial jobs have just vanished. We're on the border in Texas. We are in the agriculture sector in California. Really every corner of the country, and many of them right here in New England. We're in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and we really are excited to be seeing a real movement here to recognize that the crisis in America in local news needs to be addressed, because that crisis in local news has become a crisis for our democracy. I really believe if we don't have strong local news with accountability reporting, we fall apart as a country. And I think we only need to look to January 6th to really see just how high the stakes are here and this crisis that we're in. We don't feel the crisis as acutely here in Massachusetts. We're lucky. We have really good news organizations here. We have the Boston Globe. We have WGBH, where we're based. We have WBUR. We have the Bay State Banner. We have the Worcester Telegram. We have a lot of good news organizations in our state. We're lucky. And it's hard to see the crisis here, but if you look out across the country, it is deep. And even if you look here in the Commonwealth, think about how many communities aren't getting covered. New Bedford, the newspaper there has become a ghost paper. There's a new really exciting digital startup happening there to fill the gap. We're looking at them. If you're in some of the parts of Western Massachusetts where the local newspapers out there are really struggling, those communities are very much undercovered. Roxbury, Dorchester, historically undercovered. The Globe is doing a very concerted job to step up its coverage there, but there's more work to be done. So the crisis is even here in Massachusetts, although less so, much more stark across the country, but it's real. 2,000 communities in America now no longer have any local news. So that's 2,000 communities where no one is watching the store. We know 3 things happen when no one's watching the store. Voting participation plummets, it goes way down. Polarization rises, and there's real data on this, that when you don't have a shared set of facts locally to agree on, people retreat to the internet, they retreat to cable news, and we are all pulled further and further apart through those news sources. And the really interesting one, I think, is bond ratings go up. So you see, bond ratings go down, borrowing money gets harder. So banks do not want to loan money to communities where no one's watching the store. And so really high stakes here. That's what we're working on. I'd love you to follow our work, reportforamerica.org. Join us, follow the work, really see what we're doing, get involved. We'd love you to watch it and be part of what we're trying to do. So what we're going to really dig into here today is this crisis in local news lands at a time like no other news cycle I can remember in my lifetime. Never have we had this kind of year of news that we've just had. We all know the stories, but I think of it really as these 2 contagions, COVID, the pandemic, but also racial injustice and racism. And I think these 2 huge issues require accountability reporting, and they require access to public records. And we're going to have more transparency and more accountability and a stronger set of laws that will allow us to get at those. Or as Peter might point out, the laws are there. We just need officials to live up to them. And we're going to hear from Peter on that as well. But I want to just dig in, because the reporters we have with us are truly extraordinary in the work they do, pushing hard for public records, trying to really dig to get beneath the surface of these stories. And Kay, I think I'll start with you, because COVID is just so on all of our minds. Your work as a health reporter at the Globe, and specifically holding public institutions accountable, has been really extraordinary work, and thanks for doing it. You know, I want to hear from you a little bit about how challenging it is right now in the era of COVID to get at these public records. What's the story that you've written most recently that you think reveals just how hard that journey is? And share with us a little bit your own sense of what do we need to do to improve our access to public records here in New England?
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, quite a bit. Um, we've been writing a lot about the pandemic, the state's response to it. Most recently about its decision to hire different companies to handle both the mass vaccination sites, the websites, et cetera. And there's been a lot of questions, a lot of concern about the mass vaccination sites, about as far as equity, about people being able to get to them, people in different neighborhoods with lack of transportation, elderly people, et cetera. And so one of our recent stories was about the state's decision and sort of trying to go behind the scenes to figure out how that was made. And we did a story, myself and two of my colleagues, Adam Vaccaro and Anissa Gardizzi, and we looked at the contracts the state had given out, all with no bid, meaning that they took no competitive bids. And that's understandable during an emergency, but we had a hard time getting those records. We filed public records requests. We just didn't get all the contracts. We were able to get some of them from another source who was able to get them, and we were very lucky about that. And we were able to tell people by looking at the history of public health and how public health had trained for a pandemic and for epidemics and mass vaccinations, and to show people that through all the different records we were able to unearth that public health had trained for mass vaccinations and for handling this for 20 years, and it spent millions of dollars of state and federal money training. And within a few weeks in late November, December, all of that was sort of thrown out the window, and the state decided to hire a bunch of private contractors. And that, we were able to say how much they were being paid and what the terms of the contracts were. And that generated a lot of public discussion because it's public money, and people have a right to know how the money is being spent and how the decisions were made.
Thanks. I know your source is anonymous in that story, so I don't want to push too hard here, but I do think it's interesting to think of how news organizations, when state officials are blocking the front door, news organizations are going to have to get more creative about coming around to the side doors, the rear entrances, open windows, whatever's there. And I admire your reporting for being so dogged, but what do you think we, as people who care about the First Amendment, need to do to push state officials to understand that we need these public records? Because as you point out, this is public money, and we need to have that transparency. What do we need to do as a community that cares about this issue to push harder?
Wow, a lot. I mean, first of all, it's never giving up. I mean, we repeatedly go back to the administration and try and engage in a conversation and explain that there is public interest in that. We also, frankly, go to other public officials who may not be the ones holding the official records, because sometimes those records end up being filed or being given to other public officials. So you can always widen your search. But I mean, I think the Globe has editorialized quite a bit about the need for public records. I mean, we, as a newspaper, have often appealed decisions to the Secretary of State's office. There are times when we've also brought it to court, to Superior Court. That takes a very long time and can take months or even years. So the time frame can sometimes be way past the time when you want to report on it. But I think what we all need to do is keep pushing and not give up, and to keep pressing how important this is.
Thanks, Kay. And the Globe has such a great reputation for investigative reporting, and thankfully it has the resources that are needed to really push on these stories. And we're lucky to have that institution. There's so many smaller news organizations that it's not, it's a different set of challenges. And Morgan, I want to talk a little bit about the Bay State Banner. Morgan Mullings is, again, an example of the incredible talent that we're drawing through Report for America. I'm really so proud to have her as part of our team. I read her work. It's very good. It's impressive. And for those of you who don't know, the Bay State Banner is a Black-owned newspaper with a proud tradition, a strong tradition of serving the Black community in Boston and in Massachusetts. And it is important work Morgan does on really highlighting the issues that matter to that community most through the state legislature and in Boston city government. And Morgan, I know you're working on a lot of different stories. I'd love to hear sort of where you think we should begin a conversation on how hard it is for a smaller newsroom like yours, where you don't always have time to step back and fill out the FOIA requests, or to hire a lawyer, or to, even as Peter has informed us, you can just call him. He'll help you anytime, right, Peter?
That's
He's
correct.
right there all the time. So I would say, what is it like for you if you're reporting, let's say, for example, police? Policing is such a huge issue. We need more accountability. I know you've done some important reporting. The paper has done long time reporting on this, on the issue of the need for police reform. How do you get at those documents? What does the challenge look like for you as a local reporter at an organization with less resources?
Yeah, well, thank you for your for your kind words, Charlie. And Kay, I'm so glad you're here, because I'm an emerging reporter. I mean, I'm coming upon a year being graduated from college, my undergrad. So I'm also here to learn from you. And I feel like I'm going to get some really good, valuable information here. What I do at the Bay State Banner, I focus mostly on, obviously, city council and the state legislature, and how, laws that are passed, ordinances, things like that, are going to affect the Black community, the Latinx community, the Asian community here in Boston. But I didn't expect to also become a health reporter and a civil rights reporter, because when I applied for the job, I didn't know, that we didn't know any of this was going to happen. And so jumping into that, I was immediately, met with some barriers. Yes, we're a small newsroom, and we're really well known. I mean, Melvin Miller is such an amazing journalist. Yahweh Miller is such an amazing journalist. They have such connections in this city with their sources, that I honestly felt so behind. And then when it came to looking for documents and requests, I honestly felt completely stonewalled. But little by little, in figuring out what avenues I can go through, things did get a little better. So I am covering a lot of police reform. There has been a little lapse in coverage on that, mainly because a lot of those conversations are happening behind closed doors. Now that the state's police reform bill has been passed, and the city's police reform task force has finished its analysis and its deliberations, now there's just a lot of conversation on what's going to happen in the next year. I'm going back to some older coverage that my editor has really been hounding, which is the Boston Police Department's gang database. And not only has the Banner been after that for years, but so has the city council, pointing out flaws in it, pointing out possible flaws in the policing model, pointing out possible flaws in the field interrogation observation, otherwise known as stop and frisk practices of the Boston Police Department. And like you said earlier, Charlie, no, there isn't a whole lot of time to be persistent about filling out forms when we're just trying to get people on the phone. People don't know me, they don't know my name, they don't know my out-of-state phone number. And so that does contribute to things. So the good thing is that, because I feel like I'm such a community reporter and the Banner is so embedded in the community, that activists and city electeds who are finding new avenues to get this information, they're including us on that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I feel like makes local reporting so great, is that I don't have all the power in the world as a reporter. I would like to have all the power in the world to get documents that I feel and get databases that I feel people deserve to see. But it's not just me out here who's doing the work, and it's not just journalists out here doing the work. And because my editor has been able to connect me with people who have had a better time, getting information from cops and getting information from legislators than I have, that has been an amazing help. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys know about things like woke windows and just those kinds of things have been extremely helpful.
I think you should talk about
Morgan, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Morgan, what are some of, you said you were obstacles and you were stonewalled. Any of those involving your access to public records?
So, yes.
Like what?
So in covering, like I said, even though I cover the city and state, sometimes I'll cover real estate and things like that. There's a lot of data about eviction. There's a lot of data about what kinds of developments have gone up in the last few years, what developments have been successful, what has been taken down, the kinds of property management companies that the city is involved with that, like Kay said, if you're not persistent, you're not going to get access to those things. And
Have you put a written request in and got denied?
No, not lately.
Okay.
Peter, I would say this is something that you're really good at. Newsrooms try to be good at, but newsrooms like the Bay State Banner also have people like Morgan working on deadline all day long. And it's very hard to step back. And I know this because I've worked in smaller newspapers and I've worked in bigger newspapers where you have that backing. But I think it's interesting to say, like Peter said, the challenge is to know the law, to push hard, and to get the request in, because as Peter would put it, they're called public records because they're public. And we have a right to them. And I know it's early in your career and you said, people don't know your name. I'm going to tell you what, they will know your name eventually, because I've seen your work is really extraordinary. But it might be helpful to the audience to know, we know the traditional record search, like you were talking about land records, and we know those are cumbersome and challenging, especially in COVID, where we can't get in the courthouses where you find a clerk who helps you out, or you go to a planning board meeting and there's some planning board official in the hallways who's the one who helps you. Those are the unofficial ways journalists have learned how to get access to records. And I think it's hard right now during COVID, but I am interested in woke windows, and I am interested in some of the alternative methods for looking for records that you need, or stories you need to find, or sources you want to develop. You want to share a little bit about some of your strategies there and talk about woke windows?
Yeah, so obviously my my editor introduced me to the Woke Windows Project, and so that's been a really great baseline in terms of covering policing. When I go to interview a cop, or I am going to attend a hearing that has to do with police, and I want to know a little bit more about who's going to be there, they have compiled this amazing database of sorry, why am I blanking on the word for salary? On police salaries, how much they get paid, if they've been, if there's been any misconduct on their end that the BPD has looked into. Those kinds of things give me a better sense on what I'm getting into. And then the stop and frisk data, which is, I would say most of it is out there now, but it's also available on that site. I don't want to keep using the phrase stop and frisk because I know it's not PC or whatever, but FIOs is the abbreviation I'm going to use. And having that data to reference over and over when talking about how Black and Latinx people are disproportionately affected by over policing in this city, being able to have immediate access to that and not have it be limited right when I get here, when I'm a person who's, possibly writing a story a day, and I'm not going to be able to wait on, the press person in whoever's office to get back to me on that. That's why I'm grateful for databases like that. And then on the other side of it, in terms of
the audience know the link to
yeah,
URL
the
for
link
Woke
is in the
Windows
chat. You should
Project.
definitely take a look. And on the other side of it, in being new at this and being new to community reporting, I really think I undervalued some of the people who are really embedded in this community. I think a lot of times when you jump into a new city and you have people emailing you saying, can you report on this? Can you report on that? And people saying, things that may sound a little bit sensational to get your attention and get you to report on something. Sometimes it's just because they're really, really passionate about the issue and they know who to call to get to their boss to ask why you haven't gotten an answer about this record. And
Right.
That is really important.
Yeah, no, I love the spirit of search that you bring to it, Morgan. And I think, And I also love the spirit of inquiry where you said you're here, you're an emerging journalist and you hope you can learn today. I hope so too. I'm going to come to you next, Peter, and we're going to be looking to learn from you, sir. But I want to just point out, Kay's big breaking story that she talked about was also similarly blocked in public records. You find a source who guides you along. So it's a really important route to accountability reporting, is to use people, sources, those who can guide you. And I'm really glad you're doing it. The story.
Do you mind if I just add one more thing, Charlie?
Sure,
Just an RFA related thing.
Go ahead.
In my preparation for beginning to file more public records requests, obviously through Report for America, I do have to do trainings. Not necessarily that it's a requirement that I don't like to do, but I'm glad it's a requirement, because then we get trainings and a bunch of us get into a room and talk about public records requests and talk about FOIA and the roadblocks that we've hit and trying to help each other. And that has also been really helpful to me, just having that network and troubleshooting with them.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And I'm glad you're getting something out of it. I think it's a wonderful network you all have as these emerging journalists, really relying on each other and learning from each other. Peter, we're about to go into the Q&A, but I wanted to just get a minute or two from you. We are aware that for the last half hour of this, from 6:30 to 7, you'll be doing a real workshop on public records. And so we'll hear more from you there. But I wanted to just have you sort of talk about Kay and Morgan's work. Like, when you hear them frustrated at their access to these public records, what is your sort of, I don't know, your inspirational speech right now about how they can persist, and what are the practical ways to keep going after those records?
The practical way is not to get to me. Now, lawyers should be the very last course of action. I've been doing this now since 1977. We had people on the ground then. We had newsrooms that had 97 people, who today, the same newsroom would have 22 people. So we had more people on the ground. But I found, Morgan, the best people to ask are the lowest people on the totem pole. If you go into an office, to find someone who's been there for a long time, not the person who's been designated as the public records person, but just to ask a question as you walk in, and you get the real information. And also not to wait for the information. As an example, if you went to a public meeting or you missed a public meeting, the next day, go to that place, go to the board of selectmen, the city council, and ask for the meeting, ask for the minutes of the meetings just the previous night. Now, they're not going to give them to you because they said that they haven't been approved yet. But the law in Massachusetts is they must give you those raw minutes immediately. So ask for them. And that's an easy way to get a lot of information, because as many people know or don't know, when you ask for a record of the meeting was an hour and a half long, and the minutes like a page and a half. However, the person that took the minutes has 20 pages, but they've been redacted. So get the 20 pages, and they'll be stamped unapproved, not approved. But that's okay, get them. But I still go to the lowest person, and also just do a simple request, a specific request. I want the records for the salaries of the Board of Selectmen for the past 2 years, period. And you submit that, just hand that to them, a nice written request. Nothing, some people, and I'm not going to mention the Globe, some people ask for reams of information, overwhelming information, and the public records officer gets confused and nervous. If you ask for something very short and very small, I think you'll get that quickly. The next day, go and ask for more. But I think I get phone calls on a regular basis of people that have been denied public records. They haven't made the written request. Make that written request. And if you get denied, and I'll stop at this, Charlie, and if you get denied, don't hesitate to give my office, to give me a quick call. Because sometimes a phone call from an attorney to the town, just a phone call, a 5-minute phone call, releases the records. Okay, and they'll say no to you for no obvious reason, but they must give you a specific exemption in the public records law. And as Charlie said, my feeling is, let me see, public records, they're all public. It's a public record. they have to show you, they have to tell you specifically why they're not giving it to you. Privacy, a personnel record, they don't want to give it to you. And last thing, if you have a folder and it says personnel on it, and there's an exemption for personnel records, not everything in that personnel file is exempt. And people have to know that. Just because someone says, oh, it's a personnel file, it's not. I would say that maybe 60% are exempt and 40% you can get, in a personnel file. But no, but just don't stop. But call people,
Yep.
Call Charlie, call Justin from the New England First Amendment Coalition. If I can't get to it, one of the other 3 or 4 attorneys can get to you, Morgan. But as a cub reporter, I quite frankly think you have an edge, because if you have someone who's been around for as long as Kay, when Kay walks in the office, people get nervous. They don't know what she's going to ask.
It's so true.
Yeah.
It's true. Peter, let me get to, there's a question for you in here, and I just want to encourage everyone in the audience to use the Q&A. I see, so there's one, looks like there's one in there now, first one, I'll come to that in a minute. But there was a question that I would have as well, which is sort of when you do get confronted with that thing, like I honestly have been a reporter for a long time. I never knew I could ask for the full record of the minutes. I was always too quick to be satisfied with the typed up version of the abbreviated minutes at a meeting. But what would you say? There was a question here from Jenna who wanted to know any tips on how to ask for those when they say no to those minutes. So I know we can call you, and by the way, there's a link to your website in here, Peter, for anyone who does want to contact you. But what would you say in practical terms, like what could someone do, as Jenna's asked, right away to follow up to try to demand those?
But you have to give them to me, because that's what the law says. Could you ask your supervisor? If the supervisor says no, and even a small town, I have no objection to walking to the second floor and asking the town manager why their employee won't give me a public record. Go higher. Don't hesitate on asking. Now, I know I'm from a smaller town, from an Andover, North Andover. You can walk into town hall and talk to somebody, but that's what you do. They have no right.
Peter, would you
And if
say
they won't give it,
come armed with
wait,
that?
Charlie, if they won't give it to you in the next edition of the paper, you tell the public that they won't give it to you, that they want to have this record secret. And
Right.
You don't use executive session. You don't use, I didn't get the public record. You actually tell them, this particular record they want to keep secret. I get a lot of pushback on that, but quite frankly, it is secret. A closed meeting, executive session, nobody knows what that means. Executive session, they think of the president's talking to the vice president. It's not, it's a secret session. And that's what the paper writes. Last night, the school committee met in secret session for an hour and a half to discuss the superintendent.
Yeah, I like the clarity. Thank you, Peter. And plain speaking, which is good, and it can shock people in the newspaper when you sort of counterpunch like that just through sharing what happened. Thanks for that. I want to say we have 2 really good questions in the chat. Jerry and Cindy, I will be right with you. And I'm just going to say, I think, Chris, I wanted to just say from the Medfield Insider, first of all, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, making it happen. But Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was just more of a and thank you everyone for being here. I know in talking with Justin Silverman from NEFAC as we were planning tonight's program, that one key objective was to help inspire average citizens to play a role in their communities with regard to pushing for government transparency. As a private citizen in a small town, it took me a long time before I had a solid understanding of the public record law and also open meeting law. And when I finally felt comfortable filing that first record request, and even after that, an open meeting law complaint, it was honestly quite nerve-wracking. I suspect taking these steps come easier for journalists associated with a media outlet, but for an average citizen filing record requests and not really knowing what will happen when they get denied and they appeal, and then they're like, oh no, now what? You're often viewed when you're doing these things as a troublemaker in the community or anti-community. And, and oftentimes that comes back to bite you sometimes. So I guess the question would be is, what kind of words of inspiration and advice would you give average citizens who care about transparency in their town, especially a small town, but are afraid to take these kinds of concrete steps? And also, once they do begin to take the steps, how do they avoid sort of a Don Quixote syndrome when the search for justice and accountability just seems so difficult?
Chris, it's a really good question, and one that I think would speak to the audience, because they're not all journalists in the audience, they're citizens. And we all have a right to these public records. As Peter would say, that's why they're called public records. So I'm going to say, Kay, maybe ask you to take a shot at this, knowing that Peter's got the workshop where maybe you could even get into that in some more detail, Peter, if there are more questions along that. But Chris, this question is also sort of part of Jerry's question. And so just, Chris, your question and Jerry's question is along the same lines, which is, is Massachusetts really helpful to citizens who want these public records? And Kay, I know you're a journalist, but you're also a citizen. I'm sure some of your sources have gone after things and records and found information that they shared with you. But what's your advice to someone, from the citizen's perspective on how to get at these?
Thanks. Actually, that's how Chris and I first met years ago when she was frustrated about, I think, assisted living nursing homes. I've been covering a lot about nursing homes and quality and lack of quality, and being stymied and getting records that were public. And one of the things that I shared with her is that often there are other records are actually made public, but they're not always well advertised. So there's often databases, right? As Morgan was talking about. So one of the things that I've learned is that sometimes just Googling, you can find databases. Like at that time, it was nursing homes that we were talking about. And I was sharing with Chris that a lot of the records are available on the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid websites, that some of the inspection reports. So sometimes just looking to think about whatever it is you're covering. I mean, at the time, or the records you're seeking, whether it's nursing homes, assisted living, there are sometimes like nonprofit or help groups, support groups, senior citizens groups. I really learned, I knew nothing about nursing homes and assisted living when I started, for instance. So I learned a lot from local councils on aging. They could tell me information, senior citizens groups, that type of thing. So what I would recommend to citizens is whatever field you're looking at or whatever kind of record you're thinking or trying to get, is to think about support groups that might be springing up around that issue, because often they've done a lot of the hard work and they can point you to where the records might be or what kind of record may even exist that you may not even think about. So I would suggest that. I mean, that's a wide sweep, but a lot of times there are citizens groups or nonprofit groups for the environment, for nursing homes, for all types of different things that may be able to help you, point you in the right direction.
Thanks, Kay. And the nursing home data, the information we want for loved ones who are in nursing homes. I mean, that is a front line for citizens. My mom's in a nursing home. We are literally trying to check on how well the nursing home is doing. It's a really important issue. That's great and very practical advice. Morgan, you were sharing some strategies. You've used woke windows when it comes to some issues. Anything you've seen in terms of creative approaches for citizens to take at getting access to the records they're trying to get to?
Yeah, I think Kay's advice really hit the nail on the head. I mean, the only thing I would add is that, think about who, their strength in numbers. If you feel kind of, I totally get that sentiment of, do they even care? Am I just going to get denied? Am I going to get silence on the end? Is my email going to get shoved into a spam folder? Everything is virtual now. It's so much easier to be silenced. So I think there's definitely strength in numbers if you're partnering up, with organizations who might have been already, you might find people who have already kind of been knocking down the door on this and join them. That's a great idea. Partner with local journalists in your area that maybe have been looking into this. Or if they haven't, knock on a journalist's door and see if they can kind of, the journalist will go in front of you and you can kind of go behind them and get the public records that way. I think the partnership and letting, because I think Kay also said something earlier, that convincing people that there is enough public interest in it, convincing the government that there's enough public interest in this data, I think will put the pressure on them.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions, one from Cindy and one from Travis, that kind of go well together. So I'm going to bundle these. Cindy points out an exemption that is in the public records law that according to the Secretary of State in Massachusetts, there are exemptions such as withholding of, quote, notebooks and other materials prepared by an employee of the Commonwealth, which are personal to him and not maintained as part of the files of the government unit. It's an interesting lay of the land, but I think one thing it really points to is sort of something that candidly I didn't know as much about until Kay pointed this out to me, but our Secretary of State has not been that great about enforcing the access to public information.
What do you mean that great? They never help out.
Yeah.
This current Attorney General has done more than the past 25 years of Attorney Generals.
Okay.
Don't lead on the AG. They're not going to help you.
Okay, but the Secretary of State, Kay, you were saying you found that,
No.
I don't want to put you in too much of a tough spot here, but the Secretary of State has not had a great record for access to public records. Is that what your experience?
Yes, you know, we file an appeal, you know, because that's the step you have to take if you, that's the next step, is file an appeal to the Secretary of State's office. And we will win that appeal with the Secretary of State's office. And often we're seeking records from the Baker administration or the Patrick administration before that, or ones before that. And, you know, they'll just take more time than what's given under the law. And we'll have to call the Secretary of State's office and remind them that the time is up. And then the state will appeal, and it'll just keep going on. And we won appeals, and it just seems to drag on and on and on. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of teeth in the Secretary.
Hey, do you
of
mean
State's office.
the Secretary of State or the Supervisor of Public Records?
Supervisor of Public Records under
Big
the,
difference.
yes, I'm sorry,
Because
yes,
the Supervisor of Public Records,
Public Records.
they have absolutely no teeth. You know that. They have no
I
enforcement.
found that out, yes.
No,
yes.
they have absolutely no enforcement power whatsoever. And I've had almost every Supervisor of Public has called me and asked if our organizations, the MNPA, NEFAC, if we can file bills to give them teeth. But the Supervisor of Public Records, the people have to understand that when you file a request, I think 80% of the time you're going to be right, but it has no teeth. So their enforcement is the Attorney General's office, who does not enforce it. So be careful. And last thing on that, the towns are represented by the Mass Municipal Association, and they have their own group of lawyers. They have informed the cities and towns that they need not oblige by the Supervisor of Public Records opinions. They have actually informed that that's correct. I have letters. Okay, the main city municipal association represents half the cities and towns. They have letters stating that you don't need to oblige by any Supervisor of Public Records. So please keep that in mind when you ask.
Thank you, Peter. The thing that I think is really interesting, Kay, in your reporting is that the way the state can block you and has effectively been able to do that. It's a really big story around this tension between local health departments and the state, right now in the age of COVID, where you're trying to get it at local health information. That fault line seems to be really keeping us away from some of the facts we need to know, whether it's trying to put together timelines, chronologies, really understand the story of COVID and how it's playing out. Do you want to talk a little bit about that tension and some of the stories you've done about that?
Sure. There's been quite a bit of tension between the local and the states. The local public health departments work 26 hours a day. They, it's not just COVID they're responsible for, but inspections and septic systems. They do, restaurants, summer camps. They do a lot of work, and Yes, so the early thinking last fall was that they were going to be doing mass vaccinations, et cetera. And obviously, as I said, that changed. But it wasn't just vaccinations. There were all through the pandemic, there were decisions made at the state level about, quarantine, how long the quarantine, changing quarantine rules, changing color coding for how, if a town is in the yellow or the green or the red, meaning how high risk they are, and that affects closures. And the local public health departments were telling me that they were finding out about changes in state rules while the governor was on TV or radio or online announcing them. They were getting no heads up, and they would be on the phone at that time advising residents about how long they had to stay in quarantine and actually giving out wrong information because they weren't told that. So there was a real tension, and we've covered that at length. And I will tell you that the local health departments have been very generous with their time in helping us understand the rules and the history. And I will tell you that another way we've gotten around not getting documents without outing anyone in particular, local public health departments have access to a lot of memos, a lot of email chains. And when we haven't been able to get records, they have been generous in sharing. And I would say not just them, but in general, as a reporter and even as a citizen, sometimes you can get information by asking for copies of emails. When we file public records requests, we often, in addition to asking for documents, we ask for emails sent between different public officials, because those are public. And you can find out a lot of information about chronology, thinking,
Mhm. And by getting at them through the email threads and the chains of others
Yes.
who are in it, correct?
Yes,
Like
exactly. And you get ideas of other sources because of the email threads and chains. That has been a godsend more times than not just in COVID, but in many, many things. So, yeah.
Yep, interesting. And Morgan, I'm curious, in the state legislature, there's a question here from Travis. And Peter, I might ask you to keep this question in mind for your workshop, because I think it's a little bit more detailed maybe than we want to get to here right now, but I think it's a good question. I want to just see, Morgan, if you have anything to add here. Travis is saying, how does the legislature exempting itself from public records laws affect coverage in Massachusetts? I didn't know they were exempting themselves, and I didn't know that. But Morgan, do you run into that when you're covering the State House?
So I would say I'm not 100% aware of that. I keep thinking about my editor, like this is such a great question for him.
Yeah.
What we do talk a lot about is not being able to see all of the votes, which is kind of a controversy right now. That's been a big problem. We don't get to see every time that they vote. And on top of that, things are virtual right now, and they can kind of lean on the fact that there are technical difficulties and things of that nature. I wish I knew a little bit more about what he was talking about.
Yeah, I would say
yeah.
Peter, would you keep Travis's question in mind and go into that in your workshop and go at it? Because I think it might be, I'm not sure how to go at it right here. And there's such a really nice question here that I want to get to. But Peter, is that okay? Will you go out in your
Yeah,
work?
sure. I mean, it's a simple answer. The
there's a
legislature
link.
and the governor's office are exempt. Period. No
Always.
ifs, ands, no buts.
And that's always been true and always will be true?
I think you had mentioned, Charlie, in 7 states in the United States of America,
Right.
Massachusetts being one of the 7.
Yeah.
Michigan, New Jersey, Iowa, Arkansas, California, Massachusetts, they're exempt. And
Yeah.
there's only one case at the SJC that says that. But right now, as we sit here, you can't get those records, period.
I don't know if it's, I mean, I'm born and raised in this fine Commonwealth, and I have always thought we have these great public records laws. We are like the best, and I'm constantly being disabused of that notion, especially in the conversations we've had in preparations for this, but also just right now hearing it. But I want to get to a question here that Kevin asks that I think is a really nice broad question that I think can open a conversation a little bit, widen the aperture a little bit. And the question from Kevin is, how do ethical journalists connect with citizens who are fact averse and with whom discourse is almost impossible? I think that's a real challenge in the time we live in. We live in such a deeply divided time. It's not necessarily directly a question about public records or sunshine laws, but it is about truth. And it's about how do we as journalists get at conversations when you now run into a kind of a new wall, which is people who just don't care about the facts you're presenting. I'm curious about that. Morgan, have you experienced this in your reporting in this era where we feel like not just journalism is under attack, but sometimes it feels like truth itself, facts are under attack? Do you run into that?
Yes, all the time.
So how do you navigate? Like, how do you get connected to a citizen who's coming at you with this rejection of what seem to be self-evident, facts, discernible facts?
So I think what I'd just like to lead with is that if people knew how much information they didn't have access to, they would be way more upset. Way, way, way more upset. The amount of facts that we operate on currently is ridiculously limited. And if they really knew that, these 1, 2, and 3 things that they know, and they're getting on, Twitter or Instagram or whatever, and spouting off things like they are the authority, if they knew how much they didn't know, I'm sure it wouldn't be like that. And then that presents I don't want to blame it on people who have really polarizing views, and I don't want to blame it on people who are fact averse, because the government has a hand in that. If they are not willing to contribute to the act of fact finding, their constituency is going to be limited in the amount of decisions it can make. And whether that is strategic or not on their part is up for you guys to discuss amongst yourselves. But as much as it annoys me as a journalist that I'm just, I'm here to get you the information so that you can make the decisions you need to do, all that kind of thing.
Right.
Even though that annoys me, I do have to remember that I also exist to make sure that our local and state government is being vocal enough and being truthful and transparent enough that people on Facebook that we blame a lot actually have something to work with. And I also just want to add about the Massachusetts being exempt thing. Charlie, I had the exact same view that you did, that, we're up here and we have it so great. And I thought that I know about the exemptions, but I just didn't think that it was so wide spreading to the point when the question was brought up. I didn't think it was so bad until we really started talking about it.
Kay, for Morgan, in her early part of her career here, this sort of rejection of facts is something she's probably knows well, and it's really maybe even all you've known, Morgan, because that's the culture we're in right now. But Kay, I think, I've been on this beat a lot longer than you, I'd say, just guessing, but I would say the experience matters here, that there was a time when we had a different kind of conversation, right? When you could come at the stories with shared sets of facts. Do you feel those shared sets of facts eroding? Does it affect how you deal with the people who you're interviewing in your journalism? And does it affect the journalism you're able to do as a result?
I think, for the last year, I've been so focused on COVID. I don't think I've written about anything besides COVID and coronavirus and testing and vaccines. So it's hard to remember life before that, frankly, and maybe that's just because I'm so in the midst of it. I mean, what I was thinking about when I was listening to Morgan is the one experience that I've had is with vaccines hesitancy and people who are, and this is even before the vaccines came out. I remember having conversations last fall when the state put out a mandate that everyone under the age of 30 would have to get a flu shot because they were trying to avoid a twindemic of flu and coronavirus, COVID-19, and talking to a group and people in the group who are just against vaccines, very much against mandatory vaccines. And I remember thinking that just the heated rhetoric leading up to that, and all about the research on the vaccines coming down the pike, the COVID vaccines probably played into it, and now how polarized we are. And so that was really shocking to me as a health reporter. I knew that there had always been some vaccine hesitancy because I've covered it for years when hospitals started to have to require their workers to get it, just the flu vaccine. But so yeah, it kind of stops me. Most of the reporting I've done in recent years is health reporting. So I don't run into that as often as Morgan would, but that, you know, what I could try to do is listen and just listen and hear where they're coming from about what they don't understand or what they think the facts are. And sometimes just trying to listen and offer what you know about the science and the health, you know, the facts. But at some point, people, it's very polarizing, but I guess the best tip I can say is to just listen and ask them, why do you believe this? And what's your thinking behind this?
Mhm. It's a really good response. And I really admire you for thinking that way. I think sometimes journalists are getting, I don't know, and I put myself in this too. I mean, I think sometimes we are not listening enough. We're just so sort of impatient with the idea that we are so used to being the gateways of information that we're going to tell you how it is, and then we're going to give you the facts, and that's what it is. And we all know Cronkite used to end his broadcast with, "And that's the way it is." And he was the most trusted man in America. And I feel like we have lost trust in journalism as a country, as really as a planet. The trust in journalism is plummeting. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. I think there are business reasons that are really coming at journalism. Changes in the business model are eroding our ability to do our job. There are political reasons. We had, you know, a movement in this country. We had a president in the White House who began to attack facts, who began to really undercut truth. And I am old school about not being partisan in the journalism. And this is not a partisan comment. This is a observation of a presidency in which truth was on the line and it was being eroded. And I think it's really dangerous. I think it's how we become polarized. It's why I love this question, because it's kind of the question of the day for journalists, is how are we as journalists going to engage with citizens who are fact diverse? That's the essence of the question. And I think it's really one of the biggest questions we face, whether we're searching for public records, which is the topic of this conversation on Sunshine Week, or whether we're just trying to search for truths, plural, right? As many as we can find and as many as we can share in a story. I think that is something to really contemplate. So there's a follow-up question from Jerry that's a little more precise from an earlier set of questions around, you know, it's not just what happens when state officials are trying to block us or anything, but if I'm getting this question right, the essence of it is, what are the consequences? So in reading the questions, it says, you know, there was this earlier exchange, but the question really is, when you find an issue of violation, what does the AG's office do? Does it really even care? Are they so swamped that they only enforce and take action on the big politically charged issues? And we've seen our Attorney General take on really big and really politically charged issues in very productive ways. But I think it's a fair question. If you uncover violations, are there consequences? Are there teeth? Questioner says it's demoralizing and it can diminish accountability. Peter, do you want to take a crack at that? It's a very good question.
Well, it's very easy to answer that the Attorney General that we have now has actually prosecuted, I believe, 3 public records cases. That is 3 more than in the 40 years that I've been practicing media law since 1977. The Attorney General's office just does not prosecute public records violations. If you think they do, you're in a different state. You're not in Massachusetts. We used to go to the district attorney's office. The DA's office actually was what we always went to prosecute violations of public records law and open meetings law. That's sort of been removed. In fact, so much so to get away from so I think I answered the AG's question. The Attorney General is the prosecutional arm of the Supervisor of Public Records. When the Supervisor of Public Records issues a decision that a city or town has violated a public records request or open meetings request, then he or she shifts that to the AG. The AG does not prosecute.
But what about the consequences piece of that question, Peter? The idea that, you know, if we don't have someone watching out for these violations and there are no consequences, that diminishes the accountability. I mean, do you see that happening? And how, I mean, honestly, I think we're all Red Sox nation here. We have a lot of pride. Like how's this happening in our Commonwealth? And are there consequences when there are no consequences, will we see diminished accountability?
There are no consequences because you don't get fined. There's no teeth. There's no hammer. You violate the open meetings law or the public records law. We would like to see people get fined. In the Vermont, just last month, a radio station was successful in obtaining public records. And Vermont, with different even circuit, they actually had a $36,000 fine, not a fine, $36,000 legal fee against the municipality or the state that refused the request from the radio station. We don't have that in Massachusetts. We have a strong legislature. We have a closed legislature. We have a legislature that just doesn't believe in public records and open meetings law. When I began practicing, we had hardly any exemptions to the public records law and the open meetings law. Now, how many exemptions do we have to the public records law? We have up to the letter U, about 20 exceptions. So public records law is a public record except for these 20 some odd exemptions. And there are over 66 statutory exemptions to the public records law. So even though we say public records law, we have all these wonderful statements from the Secretary of State that we are an open state and we discourage public records law. That is just not the case. Now, it goes back to Charlie's opening statement tonight. And even in my hometown, we have either non-existent or weak local media. In the past, the town government was fearful of local media, especially small suburban newspapers. We don't have that today. We have one, in my town, we have one reporter that covers many towns. That's one town. So that, Charlie, you hit the nail. And that came up actually this morning at a Rotary meeting. Someone at the Rotary meeting says, where's our local newspaper? Now, I've been representing them since 1977. They're not existent in many communities. So that's the hammer.
Yep.
That's the hammer for public record.
I'm sad to say, I think that really is the issue here. That even when you think you have a newspaper, these newspapers are ghost newspapers. They don't really have reporters in them.
And all newspapers, the newspapers in the past were owned by families who lived in the community. Even the Boston Globe, Worcester Telegram, Springfield, Lowell, Lawrence, they were owned by families, the newspaper. Now they're owned by larger chains, many of whom I represent, but they're owned by larger chains, so they don't have a community presence. Maybe Kay can understand that. Maybe Charlie can understand that. Young reporters don't grasp. And Chris, you are the community newspaper. Okay? You, in your newsletter, you have become, what you should do, by the way, you should sell advertisements. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. You go to local media and you go to a local station and say, give me $50 and I'll put your ad on my newsletter that's read by hundreds of people in my community. And you can, that's what Ben Franklin did. That's what everyone did back in our democracy. We need to formulate citizen newspapers just as you're doing, Chris. And you can get financial support. How many people, you take out an ad, go to a local state, go to a local auto dealer. and say, "You want a little blurb in my newsletter?"
Peter, business models for the future of journalism are our next discussion. Seriously, no, I'm serious, Peter. You're right to point that out and to underscore it, and to make it even more horrifying for people who may not know this. It's not just the chains that own the newspapers now. More than 50% of all the circulation in America is in newspapers that are now owned by hedge funds. And hedge funds like Alden Capital, which owns a lot of big newspapers in this country, are buying these properties for the real estate, getting rid of the real estate, gutting the papers, flipping them at a double-digit profit margin while they can until they kill it and throw it aside. And this is real. And I want to wrap here. I want to ask Kay and Morgan, if you just want to do maybe even just like a minute closing, if you could try to just give us like something you feel that is a good point to end on. And I would like to do the same. And then Peter, I think we're still going to have 20 minutes for you to do that workshop and to really dig in with those who have more time. But just in the last few minutes here, Kay and Morgan, do you want to start us off, Kay, with sort of a point that you'd like to see made here about public records, about the need for transparency during Sunshine Week that might be a nice way for you to close out?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and I think we've said this before, but I think increasingly what we are trying to do is to impress upon local officials that are a little reluctant to give us records that A, as Peter says, it is a public record, and B, that we really want to engage in a conversation about what those records are about. And to sometimes what does seem to work and is helpful is to say, not only do we want the record, we would like to engage in a conversation about your thoughts and your perspective about the record. And sometimes that does help pry it out a little bit, not always, but sometimes. Mm-hmm. But I guess my closing thoughts would be, don't give up and be persistent. And I know citizens may not, can't write stories that say, XYZ declined to comment and declined to provide the records, but that is a very powerful tool. Because if you keep doing it, eventually there's going to be pressure to some degree. Thanks,
Kay. Excellent point. Morgan, the stakes couldn't be higher, right? I mean, we have this incredible time in our country where racial injustice has broken to the surface in ways that it's always been there. It's just come into the fore, into the consciousness for many of us more than it had been. It just couldn't feel more urgent for us to really understand the need for police reform, the need to understand the racism that's at work in the criminal justice system. And I'm just curious, like, given this really enormous moment you're in as an emerging journalist, what do you think we missed here today? What would you like to close out on?
Well, I kind of want to steal a little bit of what Peter said about citizen journalists and family journalists. I mean, the banner was started by a man who was and still is the publisher, and to be able to work with him and work directly with his family members who have participated in this newspaper for years, and to be, sort of welcomed into their family is an honor for me. And because they are a family that is rooted in Boston's community, no matter how small they get or, how much peril afflicts the journalism industry, they're not going anywhere. They're not. Their readership, they are dedicated to them. And I just think that at the end of the day, that's always what's going to win. Even though Report for America is a temporary program and I will be at the banner temporarily, just getting
for you for 3 years if they'll keep you. So that's pretty
that's true. Time. That's true. I could get a third year. Let's not rule that out.
I'm sure you will.
But just being here, and when I do get to talk to people who care about journalism, I remember It just happened today, actually, talking to a source. They said, "Oh, wow, are you new at the banner? I just love them. And I'm so glad you're here." And hearing from people just how they're just, "Thank you so much for covering this. And we really need more people like you here. And we're so glad that, that the banner is still here." That helps me stay on the mission. That makes me feel a million times better, especially when I was a college journalist. My only hope was that one person would read the article. And every time I got that response, it was like, good, mission accomplished. And to have, all of Massachusetts to be able to serve, it's totally worth it. Filing the records request is worth it. Making that hard phone call, getting hung up on, that's all of that is worth it. So
Yeah. Well, we're lucky to have you doing it. And I think you're right that trust is going to be rebuilt in journalism one person at a time. And when you feel that, that's really happening. So Kay, the pandemic couldn't be a bigger story. Morgan, I think the stories that you're covering for the community of the Bay State Banner are I think we're in a historic turning point. I hope we finally have a reckoning. I hope we have the reckoning we all talk about, and I just know you'll stay on it. But I want to say, Chris, as enormous as these two stories are, these sort of, as I started off talking about, two viruses, COVID and racism, they're huge. But the stories that probably many of us care about equally are the ones that are just right in front of us, like in Medfield, when you're dealing with very, very local issues. We need coverage of that. These are really the stories that bind us together as communities and that help us have shared sets of facts to be able to go out and solve problems together. And that's called democracy, right? So in my mind, that's really the glue that holds us together, is like Medfield Insider, that kind of local coverage. Chris, I'm going to offer a closing thought, but before I do, how would you like to end it? What did we miss here? What do you think is important for us to really hit as a final note?
Oh, I'll just offer two thoughts. One is just a personal note to all of you. I think this work is really hard, and it's exhausting. You're on this search for justice. You're on this search for uncovering information that is going to help other people, and you're constantly encountering these stonewalls, and it gets to be tiring. So when you're part of a panel like this and I get to listen to all of you, you feel like you're part of this larger community of people who share your values and who care and see the connection between what you're doing as a citizen and the threat to democracy. So Charlie, in particular, your comments are so inspiring. I would say, I think that, for the average citizen, I started this publication, this weekly e-newsletter, because I was uncovering things in our own town, but we did not have a local newspaper that would actually write about it. And I was getting so frustrated with open meeting law violations and some other really egregious actions that I just said, the heck with it, I'm going to do it myself. I have a journalism background, I've been a writer all my life, and I said, I can do this. And because people won't find out about what the real issues that are going on unless I do something myself. And I think it's, when you're a citizen in a small town, it can be difficult because some people will demonize you, like I said, and that's hard. But you have to, again, being around all of you and other journalists and people who care about this really makes a big difference. So you've inspired me and you've given me my energy to keep going. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Really, you inspire us. And I would say, Kay, Morgan, Chris, what you do it's more than important. It's our democracy at work. And really, I really mean that. And thank you for the work you do. It really matters that you're out there digging every day in very different ways to different communities and serving different communities. But the essence of it is public service. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to just conclude quickly on a note that I think for those of us who are staying with us in the group here, thank you for staying with us on a Friday night. For those of you who did stay, we do have an open bar at the end of the. No, I'm kidding. But we have to understand something that's going to feel counterintuitive to those who are in the audience if you're not a journalist. And I think for journalists, it might surprise those of you who are here too. Journalists have to get better at telling our own story. We are the storytellers. We are the members of the tribe who have been elected to go tell stories. My mentor, Pete Hamill, great New York City columnist, once said, journalists are the storytellers. They're the ones who since prehistoric times went into the cave with a torch to see what was growling. That's what we do. Then we come out and tell people what that was, right? That's our job. But one thing we are not doing is telling the story of the crisis in American journalism. We're just, it's on the business pages that Alden Capital is like laid off 30% of the staff. You might see a story here and there, but the gutting of American journalism is a story. It's a really powerful story. 35,000 journalism jobs were lost in the last 15 years. 35,000 more have been lost in the last year and a half. This is a crisis as big as the crisis in American steel or American coal, except I'd say it's a much bigger and deeper crisis, because as important as steel and coal are to our economy and to jobs and to families, journalism is important to our democracy. And honestly, I think we all feel so sheepish as journalists when we start using these sweeping statements, right? And we should. When we start talking about patriotism as journalists, I think all of us get the chills a little bit or break out in hives. Like, who are we to be doing this? But we have to make the case that journalism is patriotism. Journalism is public service. And we have to allow ourselves to be a little bit more unabashed about what can feel really sappy in saying it's patriotic. So you guys, thank you for being patriots. Thank you for caring about our country and our democracy and fighting like hell for it through the service of local reporting. And for the community, thanks for listening to this, because I think this issue is one of the biggest issues of our time, which is the crisis in journalism is becoming a crisis for our democracy. And the attack on journalism has become really an attack on truth itself. And when you get there, you start to get really into perilous territory. And we learned that the hard way on January 6th, when we all saw how fragile our democracy is. So keep fighting like hell. Thank you, panelists. Peter, we're going to need you in the fight all the time. And for all of you who joined us, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you all again for this great conversation, a much needed conversation, a very important one. Peter, with the time that we have left, I think what might be really helpful to everybody is to explain these exemptions that we have when it comes to the governor's office, the legislature, and the judiciary, because I don't know if it's well known that Massachusetts is the only state in the country whose governor, legislature, and judiciary are all exempt or claim to be exempt. How does that work, Peter? How do those exemptions work? Are these valid arguments that these offices are making? How are we an outlier here in Massachusetts?
Well, to answer your question, before I get into my philosophy, there are no exemptions. There is no reason why they should not be exempt. They just believe that they're exempt. There's one case involving the governor on a political appointment to a board in which the SJC said, the appeals going to, you are exempt. There's one case, so there's no law on it. We need to make law on it. So I can't explain the exemptions because there are no exemptions. I'm a big fellow on statutory issues. I talk about the shield law. I don't want a shield law because once you have a shield law, you're going to have 26 exemptions to the shield law. Okay. Back in 1977, we had a public records law with 2 exceptions. We have 22 now. We didn't even have an open meetings law back then because, let me think, open meetings were all open. And now, how many open meeting law exemptions do we have? We have tens of open meeting law exemptions. So I don't want to talk about the exemptions. What I am going to talk about specifically, because we have 10 minutes to talk about some of the public records law. I want to be specific for the people that are listening on what records are accessible. I don't want to go through what's not accessible. I did that once in my talk in the 70s, and my advertising director pulled me aside and said, "If you talk about how many things we can't do anymore, I'm going to fire you." I agree. let's talk about what we can do and what records we can. And I want to jump off of dovetail into Charlie's philosophy. We are a democracy. We're a democracy because we are a constitutional republic. We're not only a democracy, we're a constitutional republic based upon the Constitution. And the First Amendment of the Constitution is that Congress shall make no law, and I say that in my arguments in the courthouse, Congress may no law abridging the freedom of the press or of the speech. No law means no law. Now, I'm going to, just for 2 seconds, jump to that down. It starts with the federal government, okay? The federal government on public records law could be the biggest offender. Donald Trump, for all of his physiognomy, he was the most open president we've had in decades. You knew exactly what he was talking about at 2:30 in the morning. His public records were great. Our organization fought to get records from the Obama administration right up until the first semester of the Trump administration. And we got those because they held them closed, just as we do here in Massachusetts. So it drills down from the federal government. We need to be open. Now, the district attorney for the Middlesex County issued a statement a couple of weeks ago that she will now not give out the names of some criminals because she feels, as the Globe, that affects their ability to get a job. Now, that's all fine and well, but I think we need to know. It's almost counterintuitive to have the district attorney not giving us criminal information when she in fact should be supporting our efforts to get as much information as possible. So again, to drill down and to go to your point, Chris, what do you do? Are you the villain? Are you demonized? Every reporter in every newspaper, when they walk into a public building, they are the bad guy. Okay. When I attended on Sunshine Week, by the way, the Municipal Association's meeting, and I went from behind the pole during the break and stood up, they said there's someone from the dark side in the room. I was a press reporter. So the municipal, they consider us the dark side. So don't be demonized. You are the hero, Chris, of the community. And lastly, if you don't get any response in your community, especially small Boston, Springfield, Worcester, it's not going to work. But a small community, why don't you call the town lawyer? Don't be afraid to call him or her. Call, it's a public record. You're paying for their salary. You call them and ask them, why can't I get this public record? And when you call them, you say, Peter told me to call you. Okay? And they'll say, okay, he's right. And then they'll call the clerk and you're going to get that record. We talk about mugshots. We talk about incident reports, police officers, prosecution reports. The case came down that we are able to get mugshots, incident reports, public officials, judges, or officials before their arraignment. Think about that. We're able to get those before the arraignment. After an adjudication comes down, you can't get them. This is the way our courts are thinking. We need to change that. Also, now we talked about the internet. We talked about internal electronic, and the Globe knows about this. Internal electronic information, we can now get those. Those are public records. So ask for them. If they say we have to redact something, if anybody asks you or tells you it's going to cost you money because we have to go into our system and we have to figure out what's there to give you the information, they are not creating a public record. That you have to pay for. They are not creating a public record. It's free. If they have to redact something, they cannot charge you for that redaction. You have to know that. If they tell you we're going to charge you, say, no, we're entitled to that. You can spend as much time you want making those records secret, but we are entitled to that. Cell phones, email accounts. A public official has a cell phone that's being paid for by us. You get to see what's on that. Now, the real problems are, and I want you to think about this, when they retire, when they're not elected any longer, what happens to their emails? What happens to their cell phone records? You need to get those when they're retiring, because if you don't, we have behind the JFK Center in Boston, we actually have people that meet once a month on the third week of the month to destroy public records. We should do a story on that. I keep mentioning that to Todd Wallach when Todd was at the Globe. I said, Todd, you really have to do a story on how many records are destroyed. No one's done a story on that because we don't have the time and the effort. We should do that. Chris, you should do that. How many records are destroyed on a regular basis? And you should ask your town and cities and towns how many records they have that particular month given to the department to have destroyed. They have to tell you that. And you'll be surprised how many school committee budget records are being destroyed. Now, when you ask for a record and they say, we're not going to give it to you because it is exempt under the privacy exemption of the public records law, you have to ask them, what's so private about a police officer's record, about someone's record? There's a great case that says that you are entitled to what they consider to be privacy records. It has to be something so intimate, something about someone's disease, about their marital disputes, something so personal to them that you can't see. You don't want that anyway. You want their job performance. You want to see if they got fired because of a drug abuse. You are entitled to that information. Now, also an internal police report. You talk about Morgan, any police reports and any internal police reports, you are entitled. As soon as you know, from the Worcester case, from the moment the investigation begins, those are all public records. Everything that's written down about a police officer or anyone else in the police departments in discretion, you are entitled to all of those notes, all of that investigation, right up until the time that they are in fact found guilty or not guilty. You will not be able to see the final disposition of that whole record because that's been adjudicated to be under Corey secret. So you can do the A, B, C, D, E, F, and then not find out what the person given, but at least you can report on what's happening. The privacy exemption is always given. Half of the time, it just doesn't work. On the what other exemption has anyone been? Give me besides privacy, what else have you been denied a public record on?
Peter, actually have a procedural question for you from Cindy in the audience, if you could take it the last few moments here. We talked a lot about just how there just isn't any enforcement on behalf of the supervisor when it comes to public records decisions. Yes. So Cindy's asking, well, why don't I just go to court? Will I have more success there? And to follow up that question, if I will have more success there, do I need a favorable decision from the supervisor first, or can I just immediately go to court?
Immediately go to court. You do not need a favorable decision. If you ask the supervisor of public records, you may get a decision, this is much, by Labor Day, or maybe not Labor Day, maybe by Thanksgiving. By that time, the superintendent's been already approved. It's a moot question. So in the old days, we used to run into Superior Court, have an emergency motion, and judges will take this. You know, they want to know why the superintendent is not being interviewed in an open meeting. They're going to want to know why a public record is not being disclosed. Impoundment. Today, you're going to hear about a story shortly about an impoundment. Okay, you can't impound. If someone says the records are impounded, they're not impounded. They may be sealed, but they're not impounded. If you ever have someone say that a record's impounded, you please call me immediately. It's almost impossible to impound a record in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts of impoundment are so complex that I would say 100% of the judges get it wrong. Did I say 99%? No, 100% of the judges do not get the impoundment sealing correct, 100%. So if something's been impounded, call me, I'll get it unimpounded the next day. It's just that quickly. But exemptions, everything, and then when you file, for the answer your question, Justin, I have a list here on what happens if you file a public records request. Well, they have 10 days to answer. This is municipality and agency, 10 days to answer, 5 days if it's too much, 20 days for redactions, 5 days to answer the supervisor public records request, 20 days to extend it. Then if there's a denial, they have 90 calendar days for denial, 10 days for business, 10 days more. Well, I totaled it up. It's 171 calendar days, okay? 210 business days, 210 business days, okay? Morgan's may not be working there by the time she asks for that request. You can't wait that long. Now, how much does it cost to go to court? It costs less. If it's an important story, it costs less than what publishers believe. a lot less than publicly. And we would file a motion, an emergency motion to have it heard. Your Honor, we can't wait 2 months. Has to be heard in the next 10 days because of public records request, and there's an issue with that. So that's why I say, and again, we used to go to court once a month. And Chris, if you take your town to court 2 or 3 times, the 4th time you ask for something, it's going to be a miracle. They're going to give it to you. Okay? What?
Can I ask Peter, and actually all of you, is it better when you're looking for minutes to file a request for minutes under open meeting law or to do it under public record law?
They merge.
Right.
Okay. They merge. They merge.
Right.
Yeah. You do it doesn't matter. You file a request. It's a public record. Open meeting.
Is there a strategic reason to do one or the other?
Well, no, you're asking for the records in an open meeting. That is a public records request, period. An open meeting issue is when you can't get in. Is when they block you from getting in. Okay, but no, it is a public records request. And they should give it to you immediately. You go and you ask for it. And you know, I guess it boggles me why you can't get the request as soon as you ask for it. Again, on a weak newspaper, you can't. But I would write in your newsletter, I asked for the request and they said it was secret. Make the public know. I think Chris, Charlie, and Justin's and everyone else's comments, we need to let the public know when you do not get a request.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good place to wrap up here as we're coming up on 7. And a good reminder to everyone over on NEFAC's end, we're regularly publishing stories and accounts of these public records issues, these challenges. If anyone is running into any roadblocks, regardless of whether you're a journalist, if you're just a concerned community citizen and you're looking for information and can't get it, we want to hear these stories because so often they go untold. And as a result, we're just not informed collectively of all of these challenges and ongoing secrecy. So please reach out to me, reach out to Morgan, Kay, Chris, tell your story, get that out there and let people know about the secrecy that you're encountering and the challenges that you're facing. I want to thank all of you again, especially, Charlie, thank you for moderating this great discussion, great conversation. Kay and Morgan, so interesting, all of the perspective that you brought to this conversation and the experiences you have. And I give you so much credit to the 2 of you for the reporting you do every single day. So important. And Chris, I also want to recognize you for helping us with this event, launching a much needed news source in Medfield. Credit to you. And lastly, Peter, thank you again for all of your expertise here and giving us a better sense as to how the law works and how we can navigate some of these legal hurdles when it comes to getting information. With that said, thank you all again. Please stay in touch. I hope you appreciated and enjoyed this presentation. Justin Silverman at the New England First Amendment Coalition. Have a good evening, everyone.